Lab Boys by Timothy DeLizza. Offline bodies, colloquially called lab boys, were created from endlessly split, genetically identical embryonic stem cells. CRISPR gene edits were made to assure that the bodies were born permanently brain dead and incapable of developing awareness. At that stage, they could be used for any research shown to be beneficial to humankind that couldn't be adequately conducted on organoids. Gametes for the embryo were donated by scientists intimately connected to the offline body project. This was to assure the public and to follow George Church's personal genome project as a model for informed consent. Despite this, several popular movies, including a remake of Never Let Me Go and pulpier fare like Lab Boys Awaken, thwarted efforts. The religious and ethical coalitions that fought stem cell research were reinvigorated. In response to rumors of clone armies and sadistic, often sexual misconduct, the government put forward a public services campaign to correct the profound misconceptions surrounding the use of offline bodies in science. Ads highlighted the battery of post-birth MRI tests showing the absence of brain activity and the inability to feel, all demonstrating the bodies were truly offline. The campaign was fronted by everyman-type individuals anticipating new treatments, and the outcry slowly subsided, especially as medical breakthroughs trickled in that were attributed to lab boys. A second generation of lab boys was developed, male and female embryos chosen to represent the 5 most common American ancestry groups. Each was given a common name for their ancestry and gender, John or Juan, and so on. The multi-year development costs included input from bioethicists, small research advocacy groups, and international organizations. Interested parties participated in countless roundtable discussions of Henrietta Lacks and patients' rights to their genetic data, genetic resources as intellectual property, informed consent and privacy, the free market principles of Richard Posner and the sale of babies, and the ethics of inducing permanent vegetative comas in embryonic stem cells. Following this process, laws were passed to provide guidance for scientists as they sought gametes for the embryos from a wide pool. Donors were permitted to sell their gametes and DNA code following a public call. The winners were kept anonymous and given $1 million apiece. The resulting genetic rights were owned by the public via Health and Human Services. HHS, in turn, sold offline bodies to labs for approved experiments. Despite all these precautions, the anonymous embryo donors were quickly outed, revealing a diverse cross-section of impoverished Americans. As usage of first-generation offline bodies declined, a call went out to allow the originating embryo to finally reach maturity and escape the CRISPR scalpel. The call originated from the lab scientist community itself as an ethical obligation, a thank you. Further, there were some who saw scientific value in seeing how a living human compared to a genetically identical vegetative human. After the initial outburst of pushback, the public grew indifferent. They were not regularly exposed to lab boys and had grown accustomed to the progress afforded by the offline bodies. John was placed with distant relatives in Baltimore. More direct links had turned the scientists down, in part due to obligations to provide limited, non-invasive access to the boy for reasons of scientific value. The adoption came with an allowance that elevated his family from lower class to upper middle class, and this ongoing economic link made the privacy intrusions harder to fend off. Still, his adopted mother and father were each loving in their way given the artificial arrangement. As a child, John avoided conflict. He was sensitive and preferred the company of girls over other boys, and the company of animals over other humans. Throughout childhood, he went through phases in which he favored horses, dogs, cats, rabbits, and hamsters, before settling on pet rats. The scientists joked that his interest would keep going down the evolutionary scale, but his fickle shifting stopped at rats, and his basement colony flourished. Starting around age 6, John was asked for his views about the ethics of how his twins in the labs were treated. The first time he had been asked, during a routine visit to Hopkins General Pediatric Facility, he'd simply laughed, not grasping the question. The first time he saw a lab boy was also documented, a confusing peek at how he might look if he aged and fell into a long coma. Everyone around him was watching closely for some glint of recognition. When pressed for thoughts, he reported only a fear that his twin would wake and choke him. The researchers laughed and reassured him that no brain activity could possibly linger. When at age 9 he had a left meniscal tear while playing soccer, those watchful eyes seemed almost delighted. An aha, or of course. Apparently broad scientific consensus existed that his left side was his weaker half. He'd wished they'd told him this before the injuries and wondered what other time bombs within his own bodies they weren't disclosing. As a teenager, he quietly visited the beds of several of the older lab boys. Often even the bodies undergoing some gruesome conditions had peaceful expressions. Self-pity hit him. They're better off than me. Is that so bad, sleeping? John understood lab boys weren't serenely asleep in any human sense, not dreaming or processing memories. He ignored the researchers on the way out. All wanted absolution and feared judgment, and he gave them neither. At school, one kid was occasionally calling John Kid A, referencing the Radiohead album about the first human clone, but it didn't catch on. John's greater social problem was standoffishness. Everyone who examined him closely for peculiarities was disappointed by his ordinariness. He was famous without being exceptional. For his 13th birthday, his best friend sang a version of Hello, Dolly, referencing the cloned Scottish sheep.
Oh, hello, Dolly. Well, hello, Dolly. Why don't you go back to the lab where you belong? You're looking swell, Dolly. You're still growing, you're still cloning strong.
The words hurt a little, but plainly had been intended to mock the world's obsession. This friend also made matching book bag patches with sheep playing trumpets, which he sewed into his own bag in solidarity. John listened to the Kid A album ironically, and was surprised that it did speak to him. During a discussion of Dickens, a classmate named Penny, an acne-scarred Christian girl with blonde hair, had announced her life philosophy about fairness. When you balance the scale, she said, God gave everyone equally. God gave burdens to those with the tools to handle those burdens. For example, God provided fortitude and intelligence to those poor people like Dickens' characters. In hindsight, her comment was probably a naive regurgitation of a sermon she'd heard. In the moment, though, Penny's smug certainty caused John to snap. Thick, passionate words came from his throat, asking how that applied to the feeder rats that were bulk bred as food for snakes, crammed into glass tanks with their neglected peers, having evolved through artificial selection without their health in mind. Even if adopted by well-intended humans, they wheezed for air their whole lives. When John finished, he glared at Penny. Inside, he dared her to say, "Those are just rats." Instead, her eyes softened. Then, the wise guy who existed in the back of every class said, "Awkward," and the class laughed. And just like that, John was Rat Boy until college.